Mark. This is Mike Royer, one of the best inkers in the business. This is John Beatty, one of the best inkers in the business. This is Klaus Jansen, one of the best inkers in the business. You have here three men who have made a lot of artists look good. And when they ink good people, they make them look as good as they can be. When they make bad people, you don't know they're bad people because these guys ink them. And they also draw without inking. They also draw the stuff themselves, and we're not going to talk much about that because we're talking about inkers here. I is fascinated by the fact that I've interviewed every what you call Silver Age penciler who I could ever interview. I interviewed John Buscema and Gene Colan and John Romita and Carmine and Gil Kane, all those guys. And the topic always came up, what's your favorite inker? Who's your favorite inker? What do you like? You know, and these guys would always throw in a few digs at the guy they hated, especially if he was dead. And they would praise very few people usually. Now, what was interesting to me was there were some guys, some pencilers, who in evaluating the inkers would say, that guy was great, he inked it just the way I would. I looked at the page and I saw exactly what I had in mind. And there were some pencilers who would say, that guy was great. He thought of all these things I never would have put in. I could never have done that texture. I could never have put in those shadows or whatever. He fixed my anatomy. And then these guys would say, I can't stand that guy. He just traced what I did. He just did what I know. Didn't add anything of himself to it. And there are guys who would say, I couldn't stand that guy. He put in all this extra stuff I didn't want there. Now, the topic here I would like to ask each of these gentlemen is when somebody hands you page 8, what do you think your job is? Is it your job to make it look like the penciler if he did it himself? Is it your job to create a new piece of work? Joe Giella, who is downstairs, I believe he has a spotlight if it hasn't happened already yet. And Joe Giella was always very clear. He felt his job was to create a finished page of art using whatever the penciler had that he wanted to use. Leave it out if it wasn't. Joe used to add figures to the back if he felt the crowd scene wasn't dense enough. He would draw more people in there because he felt the page needed it. His job was to take the pencil art and make it something that he thought was good art, or regardless of how much he changed. And sometimes he changed it a lot, sometimes he changed it a little. I'd like to ask each gentleman, here's a job to ink. What is your mission here? You want to start, Mike? Yes.
Well, I started in the business assisting Russ Manning. And when you're assisting someone, you're supposed to be invisible. I guess that's where the term ghosting comes from. And so when I started inking other people, my feeling was I wanted it to look like they had inked it to finish their statement. And so when I inked like Doug Wiley, I wanted it to be lush brush strokes and all this interesting stuff that I felt he would have done. Same thing with Mike Aarons and Sparky Moore and all the other guys that I got to work with and I got in trouble once with John Verporten at Marvel because he called me and he said, those 2 Kazars you just inked? He says, I'm not really happy. And I said, what's wrong? He says, well, number one, I wanted you to give me a Joe Sinnott job. And I said, there were 2 things you didn't tell me. That you wanted me to do an ink job like Joe Sinnott, and number 2, how much more you'd pay me. Because they were penciled by Don Heck, and when I was finished, it looked like Don Heck had inked it. Now, I don't know if that's good or bad, because I've also worked over pencilers who weren't Russ Manning, and the instructions were, make it look like Russ Manning. And so I did that. I just always felt that I should finish whatever statement in pencil that the artist had left on that Strathmore.
When you're inking, like when you went to Doug Wilding's job, would you be sitting there with Doug's pencils here and some reference on Doug inking himself near you and saying, oh, I gotta make this look like that?
Well, no, but I would have examples of his inking and how he would handle certain things. When I inked Paul Norris at the Gold Key Comics he was interviewed later in his life, before he passed away, obviously. And someone said, did you ever have an assistant And he said, no, the closest thing would have been my comic books at Gold Heat that Mike Royer inked. Because unlike the first Tarzans that he did that I was inking, and I was instructed, make it look like Russ, and I felt like I hated that because they're two different talents, two different approaches. So when I finally just said, I'm going to ink Paul Norris the way I think he would do it, the Paul Norris that I grew up with the Sunday Jungle Jim comic strip, and the standard Jungle Jim comic books and things like that, and his Rick Bradford, I wanted, at least in my mind, to look at it and say, he could have done this. So I don't know if that's good or bad. I just, to a certain extent, never developed a personality of my own for a long time. And
Tell the story about Ramona Fradon.
well, Mark told me this once. And at some point in the late 70s, apparently, although I was doing best to keep up with Jack, he was doing something where I had time, and DC sent me a Plastic Man that Ramona Fradon had penciled. And the amazing thing was that with my wife filling in the blacks that I circled, I inked 5 pages a day on that. And then you told me what she told you in New York, and then when I met her in person, it was, I kind of feel like Sally Field. I mean, you liked me. But
You look a little like Sally Field.
But she said, you're the only person that has ever inked Ramona Fradon, or something like that.
Yeah.
It's that everyone else had put their personalities, their own ideas of how it should look. And I had seen Ramona Fradon's artwork, but I really didn't know what Ramona Fradon's uninked artwork looked like. So when I had these pages, I just like, this is going to be fun, because I'm going to make it look like the person that penciled it, at least what I thought. And she made me a nice compliment. She said, if I were still doing Brenda Starr, I'd want you inking me. And I smiled and said, thank you. And to myself, I went, I hate inking now. Because 21 years, I drew Disney character art. And so, thank God I'm remembered as an inker, because I love these conventions. But as a friend of mine once said on a short film he made, I can draw.
You draw very well. John, did you start out to be an inker?
No.
Does anybody, I guess that's you guys these days do.
These days they do. I got into the business professionally in 1980 when I was 19, but it was always my goal to pencil and ink, kind of do the whole thing. And there comes a time where it's like people start looking more at maybe, and it's weird because it's not about the line quality, but they do kind of hone in on it. Like maybe your ink line is a little more finesse and stuff in your drawing. And they're like, your figures need a lot of work, but that ink line's nice. So I think it kind of started for me like that, where people were pushing me more towards.
Well, most times, most inkers, my experience has been that people get pushed into inking because at that moment they need inkers.
Right.
They've got enough pencils, there's a shortage of inkers, and they turn you into what they need.
Right.
Who was the first artist whose work they had you to ink?
Probably Mike Zip.
Okay.
Because I had got to know Mike. I wrote him a fan letter, and he replied back. And he lived in South Florida. I lived in Daytona Beach, and he saw potential in my work, and he sent me pencils from a master of Kung Fu. And he said, hey, use these to practice on, because his penciling was a lot better than mine. So I think, even though he redrew over on tissue paper some of my drawings that I sent to him, he also gave me better structure in drawing than I had, so that I could practice inking, which does help your drawing. So I kind of inked a few pages, sent it back, and he sent critiques, and we developed this kind of like pen pal relationship. And then I got to know Mike personally, and we became like a team in comics for quite a few years, working on a lot of projects.
Now, did you think you were inking the way he would have inked it, or do you think you were bringing a lot of yourself?
In the beginning, I had studied a lot of what he had done, and he was penciling and inking his own stuff at Charlton, because that's the way it worked. At Marvel, he was inking a lot of his own covers, so there was enough stuff out there of him inking himself where, yeah, I did look at that a lot and see what he was doing with his own pencils, you know.
Did he encourage that, or did he?
Not particularly. I mean, when he saw something that he thought was, could be better, he would, let me know, like, you can handle this a different way, and he would explain it to me. And he had helped Wally Wood, so he, was very influenced by Wally Wood, and he would be like, you don't have to draw every leaf on this tree. You don't indicate them. Your eye will fill in the shapes, and it'll look like a tree instead of you drawing every leaf and stuff. And so, from that level, he kind of, brought me into like, okay, so it's, there's certain things that need to be completely drawn, but there's other things that can be indicated, and your eye is going to complete it for the viewer.
Tell us a time, DC or Marvel or somebody sent you a pencil job to ink, not by my exec,
Right.
and you were really proud of how it came out.
I like the stuff I did with, and too bad he's not here, Kelly Jones, at DC, the Batman work that we did. A lot of the two parts I inked of the Batman Dracula trilogy. I thought those were really nice. And we did a 3-year run on the monthly book, which was a lot of fun because Doug, the writer, was actually instrumental in getting us pulled out of the round robin that they were doing at the time, where an issue of Detective would leave a cliffhanger, and then you'd pick it up in Batman, and you'd have to take what someone else left and then continue the story. But Doug wanted us to be able to key in and do 1, 2, or 3-part stories using the traditional whatever villains we wanted to do and stuff like that. So that was a lot of fun being able to do that.
Now, one of the gentlemen I consider the great inkers all the time, Frank Giacoya, once told me that frequently they'd send him a job and he'd open it up and he'd go, I'm the wrong guy for this. I'm the wrong guy for this. Did you ever get a job?
Yep. And I even told the editor, and he said, ink it anyway.
Why were you the wrong guy for that?
A couple of reasons. Number one, I didn't feel like I had the time to do it, and number two, I didn't really care for the pencils.
Okay.
So I won't name names going
All
into
right.
that. Fair enough, right?
But were you proud of what you did anyway on it?
Not particularly.
Were you proud given the circumstances? Did you think,
Yeah, I would
I
give
did
it
the
that.
best, I did the best I could with what I was given?
And given the fact that I tried to gracefully turn the job down, and he still kind of was like, look, we need you on this. The guy's beginning, he needs help. So given that, then yeah, I could say I did what I could. And, that's part of the reason I didn't want to take it. First jobs for some people are very tough, and I saw it and I was like, it may not be right for me, because I felt, maybe it would, my reputation was also going to be on that book. So, it's kind of, one of those things where you do the best you can, and, like I said, it was the first job for this penciler, so there were problems that are beyond me being able to fix without redrawing the whole thing, and I don't feel that me redrawing a whole panel or something is part of my job description.
Okay, I'm gonna go talk to this man. Mr. Jensen, hello. Sorry I don't have my back towards you. You didn't one day say to yourself, gee, I want to be a comic book inker. You said you wanted to draw comics. You drew some wonderful comics over the years. How did you make the left turn into inking?
I had met, and maybe I've told this story before, but I was at a Phil Silling Con while I was in
What year?
High school. I was, what do you think, maybe 68, 69, somewhere around there, 69. And I had done a fanzine, and I had a bunch of pages with me that I had done for the fanzine. There was a story that...
What was the fanzine called?
Creative Adventure.
I have copies.
You do? I'm
Yes,
sorry.
Yes. Yes.
Well, in any case...
How much
I-
is it worth to you for me not to show the reprint?
That's public domain now, right, the reprint?
Yeah, it's fine. But I was walking into a ballroom where Gil Kane was exiting, and I threw these pages at Gil, and I asked him what he thought and how much longer I would have to turn professional. And he said, well, as a penciler, you have maybe 3 years. And for me, that was way too long. I wanted to move out of Connecticut. I wanted to live in New York. And he said, but as an inker, you have maybe a year. And that was my left turn.
He said, my boy.
Yes, he did, actually, he did. But that was my left turn, so I decided, because I did want to move, I wanted to be on my own, I wanted to make a living, and I decided, okay, I'll be an inker for the moment. It lasted a lot longer than I thought. The transition from inking to penciling was really difficult, both as an artist and as companies like to peg you and narrow cast you, and it's very difficult to make any kind of changes in that way. But being an inker was at first just a financial decision.
What was the first professional job you made?
It was Black Panther over Rich Buckler, and then ironically the second issue was Gil Kane.
Now, if you look back on that first ink job, can you look back on it? Are you proud of the first one now, or do you want to go back and redo the job? How do you feel about that first one?
Mark, it's funny, I heard this, a similar question the other day. I don't have a lot of nostalgia, for some reason. I don't know what it is. But I don't...
I remember not caring about nostalgia.
Yeah, well, there you go. But,
those are the good old days.
I've seen the job recently, and that particular job, as a matter of fact, was introduced. What was the villain in the Black Panther movie? What was his name? The guy who threw Panther off the waterfall. Killmonger, yes. So Killmonger was introduced, and I still have that page, so I recently sold it. But I'm okay with the work that I've done on Black Panther. There are other jobs I wish I had a chance to redo.
What went wrong with them? The ones that you wish that you would redo?
I think you would agree with this, Mark, that some penciler inker teams just don't work.
Yeah, I actually believe that bad art results more from miscasting than from lack of talent.
I think that's a very valid point. Yeah.
I have a page of Hawkman original art, penciled by Joe Kubert and inked by Murphy Anderson. And I had them on a panel at a WonderCon. I had them both sign the page, and I said to them, I think this page would have been better if either one of you had done it by yourself. And they both agreed. No slight to each other. They just felt that was a totally wrong combination. And Murphy talked about how intimidated he was and how he felt he was the wrong guy for this. And Joe said, I made me pencil this for Murphy. I thought, no, I shouldn't be doing it. And he said, and Joe said it took him as long to pencil it for Murphy as it would have taken him to just deliver the finished art.
Oh, absolutely.
Anyway.
Let me say, Mark, I'm just thinking, as you're talking, the handful of jobs that I wish I could redo were the Gil Kane jobs that I inked, except for the very last Gil Kane job. I thought, which was the second to the last job that he penciled before he passed away. And I thought and I was probably like 50 already at that point, and I thought, I think I finally got him. And then he passed away.
Well, Gil spoke well of your inking to me. When
I did not know that.
We had had Gil do a sequence in a book I did with DC called Fanboy. It was a comic that, when the sales figures came in, it was just a list of names of people I knew who purchased it. and I had Gil do a Green Lantern sequence, and I very much wanted to have Murphy Anderson ink it.
Sure.
And Gil said, no, I don't want Murphy inking me. I don't like the way that turned. I never liked that, and now that I have the power to say no, I know I'm moving. And he gave me a list of like 4 inkers, and he said, any one of these people. And you were one of the 4 people that he said he would be, that he would
Very
he'd
pleased.
be happy with, and I forget now who actually,
Well, Kevin Nolan. I think,
Kevin Nolan,
was
that's
there.
right, Kevin Nolan was available just that moment, so we grabbed him. And also, he was, I think, a little closer to what Murphy did to Gil's pencils than you would have been. But, you know, Gil did not like most of his inkers, as people I've heard. Although I have a guy on the internet who thinks I am lying to him when I tell him that Gil didn't love having Murphy Anderson ink. Even though Gil said it several times, the guy said, "Oh, he couldn't have meant it. That work was so beautiful." Tell me some of the pencilers you enjoyed most inking. Is there anyone like, oh boy, I've got, they're sending me one of this guy's.
You know, I recently DC asked me to ink John Romita Jr. Again, and I found myself being incredibly excited. And so that's certainly one. Carmine Infantino, I loved inking Carmine. I loved inking John Buscema, completely different from Carmine.
Now, were some of the things you inked in John Buscema full pencils, and some of them were what they call
That's right.
breakdowns or shakedowns?
That's right, yes. You're correct.
Would you explain to people the difference of this? I mean, I don't think some people know.
Yeah,
Understand
it's something that doesn't exist anymore. Breakdowns or shakedowns, breakdowns. Breakdowns are pencils on the board that without any blacks or shadows or detail, it's just lines. And they did that, especially during the 70s and 80s, to get more work and more product out on the market, because John Buscema, who was incredibly fast anyways, could do a breakdown book, I mean literally in a couple of days. So he could turn out 21 pages in 4 or 5 days, and then move on to the next project, which is what the companies wanted. They wanted to get as much work out as possible. So the inker was responsible for finishing the job, and it was a little more difficult than it sounds. You don't want to go in there with too heavy a hand and make John Buscema look like Gene Colan. You still wanted to make John Buscema, retain that John Buscema look. But I loved doing breakdowns. I wish there were more.
Okay.
And by the way, Gil Kane's pencils were, his finished pencils were close to breakdowns. I think you would agree.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
He fluctuated at times depending on
That's
how it was being paid or whatever,
right.
and I think Gil was having some eye problems in the last year or two, which I think may have contributed to a little sketchiness in it. For a lot of these guys, all those years of staring at the boards, it's rough on the eyes.
Yeah. But having said that, I think you might agree. Gil's pencil, everything was there.
Yeah.
And John Buscema, the same thing. Everything was there. That you needed to build on.
Okay. So you liked Carmine, you liked John Buscema, you liked
Frank Miller.
Frank Miller, obviously. You did a lot of stuff with Frank. It seemed to me that you were kind of dominating a lot of the stuff with Frank, with textures and the tones, and there was a way that your work was colored. When you were inking a story, I think the colorists approached it differently. You know what I'm saying by this?
I think so.
There was a certain tendency, because your work had a lot of shading and a lot of texture in the inking. You didn't, there's a lot of guys, they have one line, and the machinery the same way the people, whatever. And you have a wide range of lines and textures. So do both of these gentlemen here. The inkers who can't draw generally have one line. The guys who draw have some variation there. It seemed to me that, and then right in the middle of it, there's a couple periods where you penciled and inked a couple of stories. For, I think, DC Comics Presents a Superman Adam Strange, am I remembering?
Yes,
right?
you're
Okay.
exactly right.
I didn't look this up. I just remember. I remember looking at it, and I didn't catch as I was reading the story that you had penciled. And I'm going through it, and I'm like, this is really good. I went to a pencil, and I went back, and it was you. And it was. I guess my question I want to get to here is: do you feel that all the guys you think prior to some penciling assignments changed you as a penciler? Did you pick up stuff from these guys? And at any point, did an editor say, hey, can you make this look more like Frank Miller? Can you make this look more like John Buscema?
You know, I don't think anybody ever said, you know, make it look like a specific artist, although there was a house style, obviously, at Marvel. I know that early on, like my first 20 years, probably before 15 years before I got to Frank, because, well, you know, I don't want to bore you with this, but they, you know, the Marvel and DC, they love success. And, you know, that's what it's big. They like to sell comics.
They seem to sometimes be trying to not reach it.
That's very good. We can talk about that too. But so when my stuff was selling at a certain point, which actually was fairly, you know, even that Defenders Annual, maybe you remember that with Kane.
Yes.
A lot of people loved that job.
I thought that was great.
And it was, you know, a sales success. So they leave you alone after you've established that you can succeed at what you're doing. I'll tell you that there was one day I went to, I did a Daredevil, Bob Brown pencil, the Daredevil. And I put a Zipatone, you guys know what Zipatone is, the dot pattern. I put a dot pattern in the back, and there was a fence underneath the Zipatone. And John Romito Sr. called me into the office and said, you know, this is not going to print well because it's going to make a moire pattern, and it's going to, you know, it's basically going to get, you know, look weird. And I didn't know what a moire pattern was, so I said to John, well, that's what I wanted.
Can we explain? A moire pattern is when you have, you know, these dots, and you have other dots, and they're on top of each other, and they create, the combination of two dot patterns creates an unintended, kind of almost psychedelic little thing.
It's
kind of flared.
Maybe the equivalent of pixelation.
Yeah.
You know, it pixelates. But I said to
And
John,
the person who taught me not to do that was Mike. Mike is the one who taught me about it, about how you put Zipatone down at a certain angle, 45-degree angles and such.
Yeah, there was a way to apply it so that the dots and color wouldn't conflict.
Yes. You're the one who taught it to me, so anyway. Okay, now I want to get involved everybody here now. We talked individually, each person here. Name for me, everybody, name somebody else, and someone who's not in this room, whose inking really impressed you.
Danny Mickey.
Jerry Ordway?
Jerry's on a panel. Name somebody whose inking really impressed you.
You know, my influences are primarily Dick Giordano and Tom Palmer. And then below that is Wally Wood. Yeah, people like that.
Okay.
That's
You worked with Dick a lot on things, right?
I did. I was his assistant for about a year when I was a kid.
Now, when you were assisting Dick, what did that mean? How much did he did the figures, you did the backgrounds, or?
That's right. I would do the backgrounds, and then he would look at the pages and he would say, don't do this.
How old were you, sir?
18, 19. So it was about a year, but it also meant that I got to see him work, which was surprisingly valuable to see somebody else apply their craft, you know, firsthand. And I learned a lot by just watching him. And look, I don't know about Mike and John, you know, I don't know if you have work next to your desk that you look at, but I always have pages by Dick Giordano next to me, you know, to see how he solved problems. Dick was amazing.
Mike, next to your desk, I remember at your studio Whittier, at one point you had a couple of issues of Green Lantern, The Kill King was in by Murphy Anderson, and you had the couple of issues of The Submariner where John Buscema was in by Frank Giacoia. And tell me other editors who impressed you.
Well, the first time I ever saw his work, of course, we're supposed to talk about people that aren't here, but just blew me away.
Mike, that's very kind of you to say.
I learned a lot by studying other people and trying to figure out what tools they were using. And of course, I learned from one of my mentors Richard Sparky Moore, that it didn't make any difference what the tool was. It depended on what degree of success you were having with the muse, and you put in your hand whatever would work. If it was a matchstick and nothing was working. But I respected a wide variety of inking styles. And when I first had a conversation with John Romita Sr., and he told me that he, especially in his early stuff, Western comics and so on, that he inked with a Winsor Newton #4, I thought, my God, this guy is brilliant, that he could take that brush, and somebody said he probably used a whole bottle of ink for each page because he'd fill that furrow and then remove it. But there were a lot of guys that influenced me, but a lot of them from the comic strips. But I was easily influenced by people, and especially influenced by styles that I knew no way could I ever do it. And it would intimidate me trying to do it. But you had a looseness that just, because I've always been so tight, and you had a looseness that blew me away. And, the stuff you mentioned, my favorite Gil Kane comic books were those Green Lanterns that Murphy Anderson inked, and the Spider-Mans that Johnny Romita inked.
Was it Gil Kane?
Gil Kane. Because everything that I admire in Kane only worked for me when Kane inked it himself. And Murphy Anderson and John Romita in many ways softened his hard edge, but I don't collect any old comic books anymore. Maybe I have a couple of things from my childhood in the 50s, artists who I actually wound up meeting, but I still have those Green Lanterns.
Okay. That's neat stuff. I remember John Romita is kind of an interesting thing. He didn't ink a lot of other people at Marvel's. This is from John Romita Sr. And when he did, he didn't follow the pencils that much. Those issues where he inked Gil Kane on Spider-Man, he redrew several panels completely.
Well, he told me that he took a kneaded eraser and just...
Yeah. And he told me this story one time. At one point he had, he was doing the Spider-Man daily strip. He had Sal Buscema pencil 2 weeks of it. And I guess this money came out of John's own pocket to do this, to hire somebody else. And he got the pages back, and he erased everything and redrew every panel from a different angle, obliterated whatever Sal Buscema had done. And I said, so you wasted your money hiring him? He says, no. He helped me figure out the panels. After I saw him do it, I went, oh, that's an angle. Now maybe I'll just tilt it a little more this way. So he redrawn. It was kind of like he would use the pencils as a rough, as rough sketching, and then go in. He apparently had, as many pencilers do, a little problem facing blank paper sometimes, and it helped to have somebody else put something else down, even if you erased all of it. But he did an amazing job. There's one Marvel love comic. It's one of those our love stories and my love books. It's got a story in it about this black couple. It's Colin, inked by John Romita, and it is about as good as Gene Colan art ever looked at in its entire existence. John,
I know everybody loves superhero comic books. You brought up those love comics at Marvel.
yeah,
There's some of them, and my favorite John Buscema and John Romita art is in those books.
yeah, it's very good. John, do you have some inky heroes?
Al Williamson, Rosetta, I like his teamwork a lot. There was one thing, this occurred to me, I don't know, years ago, and it's going back over to Klaus real quick, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When I was growing up, I was more into comic strips. It wasn't until I was about 14 I discovered the superhero comics and stuff, but I was a big fan of Hank Ketchum. And when I look at Klaus's work and I see all the line weights, the various textures and stuff, did you ever study Ketchum?
No.
No? Because
Is it similar, you think?
I'll tell people, like I'll look at Ketchum, I'll be like, I really looked at a few of his panels and it's like, pure Ketchum. The way he'll do like grass texture or hatching or folds in clothing or something. The real fine line to a heavy line, that type of, and it's like, I'm like, I'm seeing Klaus in here. I don't know if he ever studied Ketchum or was a fan or what,
You know, the one strip artist that I really did study was Bill Larson. And I don't know if you would agree, I think there is some similarity between
Yeah.
Jim and Bill Larson.
Yes, I could see that.
Well, you, in both cases, you got guys who look like they basically drew an ink.
Right.
Whatever they did pencil-wise, the construction of their finished art is an ink line. And it's with the thick and thin and textures. And there's a certain speed. You get that feeling that it was rapidly. That's an interesting point there. And Al Williamson, now you talk about Al Williamson, the guy who inked himself, or Al Williamson, the guy who inked Kurt Swan and other people?
Probably more of his stuff that he inked himself. But then even going forward, when Al started doing, comics, probably in the 80s sometime, when he started doing a lot of inking. Now, I met Al at a convention and he had this big portfolio of originals. I'm sitting next to him. He's like, "You want to look?" And I'm like, "Yeah." It's like,
You spent some time looking at Al's stuff.
Oh, I love Williamson's work from the early EC comics. And I was fortunate enough to meet Al and actually be part of his extended family. His mother, after just one day of staying with the Williamsons, said, "Just call me Mom, Mike." Williamson probably did have an effect on me, but I never tried to emulate that because there are just some pinpoints that I can't get to work the way Williamson did. What was the question?
Oh, just you hung out with Al Williamson, did his work a lot.
Well, I loved his work. He actually put me in X9
I
twice.
remember that, yeah, you were a character on the page.
Yeah.
You were an art, you had it on folio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are those of us who love Williamson's work, and I would say 80% of the success of his work was what he did with the brush and the pen after he'd laid his things out. But those of us who love old movies and Republic Pictures serials always like the fact that whenever Al Williamson had an automobile in Secret Agent Corrigan, the license plate was 39013, which is the villain's old prison number in a classic serial called Daredevils of the Red Circle. And the only time the license plate on a car in X9 wasn't that number was the first time I was in the strip, and it's X9 is way in the back in a Mustang, which was my Mustang, and I'm in the foreground crossing the street, and the license plate are the first 5 digits of my phone number. And
944-55.
Yeah.
I remember why do I remember Mike Royer's phone number from 1969? I don't know my phone number, but I remember his phone number from Whittier in 1969.
well, I will point out that a divorce present from my first wife was personalized plates, and in California you had to have 2 letters of the alphabet. So my license plate was NO 39013. When I moved back home to Oregon, it's now simply 39013. The O is over the pine tree in the center of the license plate. And in having that plate for 38 years, only 6 people have ever asked me about it. And one of them was a writer that had moved to California to work with Leonard Maltin on a project. He said, "I got this great apartment, a good job with Leonard Maltin. I just leased this car. I went to the DMV, and they told me the personalized plate I wanted was already used." And I said, "What was it?" He said, 39013. And I said, "Would you like to step outside?"
All right. One more thing about Dick Giordano.
Sure.
Dick. Remember DC in the 70s did these 35-page stories in Gothic horror comics. They tried these Gothic things. Dick got a Mike Sikowski 35-page pencil job to ink for one of them. And he apparently did not have a tight deadline. And Dick decided he was going to ink every inch of it himself. He was using a lot of assistants at the time. And I got the original art to this story. And it is the most beautifully inked comic book of all. It is Dick having all this fun, using every texture he had at his disposal. And it's amazing. I am one of these people who thinks, like when people start talking about, who's the best inker for Neil Adams? I will say, well, Dick Giordano, depending on how much of it Dick did,
Hmm.
because he had assistants, I think you'll agree, not all of the same capability, and, you know, very few of them were Dick. When he was at his absolute pure peak in doing work himself, he was one of the greatest inkers I think ever was in comics, and it kind of makes me uncomfortable sometimes to look at some of the stuff that's got his name on it, that is clearly 5 other guys doing 80% of it. And I want to bring one other thing here. Because there's a guy in the Jack Kirby collecting area who is convinced that you ghost inked an issue of Mr. Miracle with Vince Coletta.
No.
And we've all told him he's crazy. He says, no, I recognize his
No, no, no.
style.
No.
Your Mr. Miracle shirt reminded me of that. So, we're going to put this video on YouTube, and I'm going to make him watch your denial.
Yeah, no.
Is there anybody that you ever wished they'd given you a pencil job to ink and you never got it? Is there anybody that you ever wanted to ink and you said you saw this guy's working on it? Gee, I mean, I just feel a kinship to him. I want to bond with his pencils. Anybody?
Well, I always wanted to ink Jack Kirby.
Yeah, that would have been.
Okay.
Tim Sale. Tim asked me to do, I think, Dark Victory.
Is that based on seeing Tim's finished art or seeing his pencils?
The finished art, yeah. I watched him draw, but he asked me to do Dark Victory, and I was busy with something else, and I regret turning that down because I think we would have made a really good team.
I think it would be a natural combination.
Yeah. It would have. I think it would have been a collaboration that extended through the years. Yeah. But I think I did okay anyways.
No.
I mean, it's all right.
We're not faulting your career in any way.
By the way, Mark, if I may say about Mike Sekowsky and Dick Giordano, when you're young, you have very undeveloped artistic knowledge. And one day I told Dick, I said, how could you ink Mike Sekowsky? It's so ugly. And he said to me, he looked at me very seriously, and he said, it's all design, and it's really good. And I learned from that there's more to just the superficial surface look of somebody's work, that there actually is real thought behind what Mike Sekowsky did. And Dick was smart enough and a good enough artist to pick up on that and play with it, in that job that you were talking about.
He told me a couple times he loved inking. I was a big fan of Mike Sekowsky's work and everything. I mean, there's times when he had personal problems, and there's times, and again, like you said earlier, I think people frequently were miscast. I think Mike was miscast. Actually, Mike was miscast doing superhero or adventure comics altogether. I have this theory that if a life had taken a little different turn, Mike Sekowsky would have out Charles Adams as a wicked cartoonist, the most amazingly perverse, dark sense of humor. When he was working at Hanna-Barbera, he drew the funniest damn cartoons on the wall of attacking. Everybody at Hanna-Barbera was insulted by a Mike Sekowsky caricature at one time, and they were hysterical. He was just, and he was one of these guys who it just came out of him. Every so often I'd look at a page and go, hey, that man's drawing like Mike Sekowsky. It's hard to wrap your brain around the fact that that is Mike Sekowsky.
This Wonder Woman was amazing.
It was a terrific gift, yeah. And he did. I actually have the single greatest Mike Sekowsky job, and I have the only copy of it. I have an unpublished story he drew for me. I didn't ask him for this; he just drew it. It's a